She took care of her boss for 20 years, and before she left, his son called her. What seemed to be a simple goodbye turns into an unexpected confrontation. He, who never recognized her dedication, now wants something from her. But what happens next will turn everything upside down. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. Mondays. Dawn always arrived the same way at the mansion on Magnolia Street. Nancy woke up at 5:30 in the morning, as she had done for the last 20 years, with the same silent care of someone who knows every sound in the house. Her bare feet slid across the cold marble of the hallway, avoiding the creak of the third floorboard that led to the main bedroom. There slept Mr. Thomas, the 82-year-old man she had cared for since she arrived at that house, still young, at just 35 years old, and with a heart full of hopes that time had molded into something different, something deeper. Thomas Wilson had been a respected businessman in the city, owner of a chain of fabric stores that prospered for decades. Now his hands trembled when he held his coffee cup, and his eyes, once penetrating and decisive, carried the fog of age and loneliness. Nancy knew every detail of his routine, every preference, every small discomfort that time had brought to that once strong body. That morning, like every other, she prepared the coffee exactly as he liked it, strong, with 2 teaspoons of crystal sugar and a touch of warm milk. The silver tray, a family heirloom that she religiously polished every week, also carried 2 slightly toasted slices of French bread and his morning medication, organized in the small glass container she had bought with her own money years ago. When she entered the room, Thomas was already awake, as always. His eyes met hers with that expression she had learned to decipher over the years. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't love in the romantic sense, but something more subtle and profound. It was recognition. He knew she was there, knew he could count on her, and that was enough. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," Nancy said with the soft voice she had cultivated especially for those morning moments. "How was your night?" Thomas mumbled something unintelligible, but she understood. The night had been long, filled with the ghosts that visit the elderly in the dark hours. Nancy helped him sit up in bed, adjusted the pillows behind his back, with the care of someone handling something precious and fragile. While he had his coffee, Nancy opened the heavy curtains, letting the golden morning light gently enter the room. The view from the window showed the garden she herself tended to in her spare time, with the rose bushes she had planted in her second year of work and that now bloomed exuberantly, as if they were a reflection of the care she dedicated to everything in that house. During all these years, Nancy had built a routine that was both a ritual of care and a silent dance of undeclared love. She no longer knew if she cared for Thomas out of duty, out of affection, or out of something deeper that had grown within her over time. What she knew was that waking up every day and seeing him there, breathing, needing her, gave meaning to her existence in a way she had never experienced before. After breakfast, she helped him with his bath. Thomas had lost much of the autonomy he had in his youth, but still maintained a dignity that Nancy deeply respected. She prepared the water at the exact temperature, arranged the soft towels, and always withdrew whenever possible to preserve his privacy. When he needed help, she offered it naturally, without embarrassment, as if they were 2 old friends who had transcended the barriers of shame and modesty. The mornings always followed the same pattern. After the bath, Nancy dressed him in clean, ironed clothes chosen by herself at the city mall. Thomas had lost interest in his appearance a long time ago, but Nancy knew that keeping well-dressed was a way to preserve his dignity. She chose cotton shirts in soft tones, comfortable pants, and leather shoes that she polished every week with the same care she dedicated to all other details of her life. During the morning, they sat on the back porch, where Nancy had placed 2 rocking chairs she bought at a clearance sale years ago. There, Thomas remained silent, watching the movement of birds in the garden, while Nancy embroidered or read aloud excerpts from the newspaper that she considered interesting for him. They weren't conversations in the traditional sense, but a form of companionship that both had learned to value. Thomas sometimes told stories from his youth, fragments of memories that emerged without warning. Nancy listened to everything with genuine attention, asking questions that encouraged him to continue. She had become the guardian of these memories, the only person who still took an interest in the stories of a man who had been important in his time, but who was now just a shadow of what he once was. Lunch was always at 12 o'clock sharp. Nancy cooked simple but nutritious dishes suitable for Thomas's age and needs. She had learned to cook by watching the house's former cook, Mrs. Betty, who had retired when Nancy arrived. Over time, she developed her own style, discovering which flavors pleased Thomas's palate more and which foods were good for his delicate health. The afternoons were dedicated to medical care. Nancy accompanied Thomas to all appointments, carefully, noted the doctor's instructions, and administered medications at the correct times. She had become a kind of self-taught nurse, learning to measure blood pressure, observe signs of discomfort, and identify when something wasn't right. The doctors respected her, recognizing in her a dedication that went far beyond the professional. When afternoon came, around 3 o'clock, Thomas usually napped in the living room armchair. Nancy took advantage of these moments to take care of the house. She cleaned each room meticulously, as if the mansion were her own home. She polished the antique furniture, watered the plants, organized the books in the library that Thomas hadn't visited in years. It was her way of showing love, through care for everything that surrounded him. At 5 in the afternoon, punctually, Nancy prepared tea. It was a sacred ritual that she had developed in her 3rd year of work. She used the family's English porcelain service, the same one Thomas's mother had used on special occasions decades ago. The tea was always accompanied by homemade cookies that Nancy made on Sundays, preparing for the week ahead. Thomas drank his tea in silence, but Nancy knew that moment was special for him. Sometimes she caught him observing her with an expression she couldn't completely decipher. There was gratitude there, but also something more complex, a mixture of dependency and affection that neither had verbalized throughout all those years. The nights were perhaps the most intimate moment of their routine. Nancy helped Thomas prepare for bed, making sure he was comfortable, that he had water within reach, and that all nighttime medications had been taken. She left a small light on in the hallway, knowing that he sometimes got up during the night and needed guidance to find the bathroom. Before retiring to her room on the upper floor, Nancy always said the same phrase, "Good night, Mr. Thomas. If you need anything, just call me." And he always responded with a nod and a mumbled thank you, words that carried the weight of 20 years of unconditional care. In her simple room in the mansion's attic, Nancy reflected on her life. At 55, she had dedicated almost half of her existence to this man. She had no family of her own, had not formed lasting relationships. Her entire life had been molded around Thomas's needs, and she no longer knew if this had been a choice or a natural consequence of who she was. There were nights when she wondered what would happen when Thomas passed away. The idea haunted her not only because of the prospect of loss, but because of the uncertainty about her own future. She had saved money over the years, but knew her savings wouldn't last forever. More than that, she didn't know what it would be, like to live without having someone to care for, without having a routine that gave meaning to her days. But these reflections were always brief. The next morning, she would wake up again at 5:30, prepare the coffee with 2 teaspoons of sugar and a touch of warm milk, and continue the ritual of care that had become the essence of her existence. This was how Nancy had built her life, one day at a time, one gesture of care after another, silently weaving a tapestry of love that she herself did not completely understand, but that had become the foundation of everything she was. The signs had begun almost imperceptibly. Thomas, who had always been a man of few words, was even more silent in recent weeks. Nancy noticed that he let his coffee grow cold in the cup more often, that his eyes got lost in the garden for longer periods, as if he were seeing something she couldn't. It was as if he was slowly saying goodbye to everything, in a private and silent ceremony that only he understood. On Thursday of that week, Nancy noticed that Thomas hadn't touched the bread at breakfast. When she asked if he was feeling well, He just smiled melancholically and murmured, "Nancy, you've been very good to me." These were the first kind words he had directly addressed to her in a long time, and the tone had something definitive about it that sent a chill down her spine. Throughout that afternoon, Thomas stayed awake longer than usual, watching her as she took care of the house. His eyes followed her with an intensity that Nancy hadn't noticed before, as if he were committing each of her movements, each gesture, to memory. When she prepared the 5 o'clock tea, he held her hand for a few seconds before taking the cup, a rare and unexpected physical contact that left her both moved and confused. On Friday morning, Nancy woke up with a strange feeling. It was 5:30 on the dot, as always, but something in the silence of the house seemed different. When she entered Thomas's room with the breakfast tray, she found him lying serenely, with a peaceful expression she had never seen before. His eyes were closed, and an almost imperceptible smile curved his lips. Thomas had passed away during the night, quietly, as he had lived his final years. Nancy stood by the bed for long minutes, holding the tray with trembling hands. There was no despair, no screams, just a deep, dull pain that settled in her chest, as if a part of her had departed with him. She had imagined this moment so many times over the years, but never knew what it would be like in reality. Now she knew. It was as if the meaning of her life had drained away in an instant. After a few minutes, Nancy managed to react. She put the tray on the dresser and approached Thomas. With the same care she had always shown, she tidied his grey hair, properly closed his pajama shirt, and crossed his hands over his chest. It was her last gesture of care, the silent goodbye she offered to the man who had been the center of her life for 2 decades. The call to the family doctor and to Michael, Thomas's son, was made with hands still trembling. Dr. Matthews arrived first, confirmed what Nancy already knew, and provided all the necessary documentation. Michael arrived 2 hours later, coming from Chicago on an emergency flight. Nancy hadn't seen him in almost 3 years, since his last visit to his father at Christmas. Michael Wilson was a 45-year-old man, successful in the financial market, always dressed in expensive suits and with an air of permanent impatience. When he arrived at the mansion, he greeted Nancy with a curt nod and went directly to his father's room. Nancy observed him from a distance, noting how he looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed grief and relief, as if his father's passing was both a loss and a liberation. In the days that followed, Nancy found herself in a strange and uncomfortable position. For 20 years she had been responsible for all decisions related to Thomas's care, but now, with his passing, that authority had automatically transferred to Michael, and he made it clear from the first moment that he didn't consider her opinion relevant to the arrangements that needed to be made. The wake was organized hastily and without ceremony. Michael chose the simplest package from the funeral home, a small, poorly lit room where few acquaintances came to say goodbye to Thomas. Nancy sat in a corner, observing how the life of a man she had known so intimately was summarized in a cold protocol ceremony. During the few hours of the wake, Nancy waited for someone to approach her, to recognize her dedication, to thank her for the years of care she had devoted to Thomas. But the people who came only greeted Michael, offered condolences to him, as if Nancy were just another funeral home employee. She remained invisible, as she had been during all those years, but now that invisibility hurt in a way she hadn't anticipated. Michael moved around the room with businesslike efficiency, greeting people, organizing details, always looking at his watch as if he had more important appointments waiting for him. At no point did he approach Nancy to talk, to thank her, or even to ask how she was feeling. To him, she was simply part of the scenery that had surrounded his father's life, something that now belonged to the past. The burial was even more painful. The ceremony lasted less than 30 minutes, with only a few formal words from the priest and no personal tribute to Thomas. Nancy remained apart from the main group, watching as the coffin was lowered into the ground in a mechanical and impersonal way. At that moment, she felt she wasn't just saying goodbye to Thomas, but to an entire life she had built beside him. After the ceremony, when the few people present began to disperse, Michael finally approached Nancy. But it wasn't to console her or thank her. It was to communicate a decision he had already made on his own. "Nancy," he said with the cold tone he used in his business negotiations, "I appreciate everything you did for my father during these years. But now that he's gone, I won't need your services anymore. The house will be sold, and I need you to arrange to remove your things by the end of the week." Nancy looked at him without being able to fully process what she had just heard. After 20 years of total dedication, after having given up her own life to care for Thomas, she was being dismissed as if she were a temporary employee whose contract had expired. There was no recognition, no gratitude, not even a gesture of consideration for the years she had dedicated to that family. "Michael," she managed to say with a choked voice, "I took care of your father for 20 years. I stood by him in every moment, in the good times and the difficult ones. And I thank you for that," he interrupted without showing any emotion. "You were well paid during all those years. Now everyone needs to move on with their lives. I'm sure you'll find another job without problems." At that moment, Nancy understood that for Michael, the 20 years of her life had been just a service rendered, a commercial transaction that had come to an end with Thomas's passing. All the love, all the care, all the dedication she had offered were seen by him only as professional obligations that had been adequately compensated with a monthly salary. Nancy nodded in silence, not because she agreed, but because she understood that there was nothing more to be said. Michael had already made his decision, and she had no power to question it. She was just a dismissed employee, a figure who had served a purpose and now had no more use. On the way back to the mansion, Nancy reflected on how drastically her life had changed in a matter of days. On Monday, she had woken up as always, prepared Thomas's coffee, cared for him with her usual affection. By Friday, she found herself alone in the world, without a home, without purpose, without anyone who recognized the value of what she had done during 2 decades of her life. During the following days, Nancy packed her few possessions in an old leather suitcase she had bought when she arrived at the mansion 20 years before. Her clothes easily fit into a single suitcase, as she had always been a person of few material possessions. What didn't fit in any suitcase were the memories, the shared moments, the gestures of care that had given meaning to her existence. Michael appeared only once during these days to check on the progress of the move and to give Nancy a small sum of money he called a gratuity for years of service. It was a modest amount, but Nancy accepted without comment. She knew that for Michael, that money represented the definitive closure of any bond between them. On Tuesday morning, Nancy left the mansion on Magnolia Street for the last time. She had found a room in a modest boarding house in the city center, a small, simple space that cost half of what she earned when she worked for Thomas. It was all she could afford with her savings and the small gratuity she had received from Michael. Before leaving, Nancy took one last tour of the house. She walked through the rooms where she had worked for so many years, touched the furniture she had polished weekly, looked for the last time at the garden she had cultivated with such care. In the kitchen, she hesitated in front of the cabinet, where she kept the porcelain tea service. For a moment, she considered taking just one cup as a memento, but decided it wouldn't be right. That belonged to the Wilson family, not to her. When she finally closed the door of the mansion, Nancy felt she was also closing a chapter of her life that could never be reopened. She had entered that house as a young woman of 35, full of hopes and willingness to work. Now she was leaving as a 55-year-old woman, alone in the world, carrying only a suitcase and a heart full of memories that no one else shared with her. St. Joseph's boarding house was on a narrow street in the city center, between a small market and a used clothing store. The 3-story building, with its faded facade and small windows, housed people like Nancy, retired workers, widows with modest pensions, young people who were starting life with few resources. It was a completely different world from the mansion where Nancy had lived for 2 decades. The room Nancy rented was on the 2nd floor and had just the essentials: a single bed, a small wardrobe, a desk that served as a dressing table, and a window that overlooked the building's inner courtyard. The bathroom was shared with 3 other rooms on the same floor. It was simple, clean, and worked perfectly for her current needs, but represented a drastic change in the quality of life she had known. In her first days at the boarding house, Nancy struggled to establish a new routine. For 20 years, her life had been governed by Thomas's schedules and needs. Now, for the first time in decades, she had no fixed responsibilities, had no one depending on her, had no structure that gave meaning to her days. The freedom, which should have been liberating, proved to be astonishingly empty. Nancy woke up every day at 5:30 in the morning, as she had always done, but there was no more coffee to prepare, no medicines to organize, no one to care for. She would lie in bed for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the boarding house waking up, doors closing, footsteps in the hallway, muffled conversations. It was a world of strangers, each carrying their own stories and difficulties. At 5 in the afternoon, punctually, Nancy prepared tea. It was a ritual she couldn't abandon, even being alone. She had bought a small kettle and some simple cups at a housewares store near the boarding house. It wasn't the Wilson family's English porcelain service, but the tea had the same taste, and the ritual gave her a sense of continuity that she desperately needed. During these solitary tea sessions, Nancy found herself talking to Thomas as if he were still there. She would tell him about her day, about the people she had met at the boarding house, about the difficulties of adapting to her new life. They were one-sided conversations, but they helped her process the enormity of the change that had occurred in her life. Mrs. Stella, the owner of the boarding house, was a 60-year-old woman who had lost her husband 5 years earlier and decided to turn the family home into a business to support herself. She had a maternal way with the tenants, and soon noticed Nancy's melancholy. One afternoon, she knocked on Nancy's door and invited her for coffee in the common kitchen. "You look like someone who cared for someone for a long time," said Mrs. Stella, serving coffee in a simple china cup. "I recognize that look. When we lose someone we've cared for, it's like losing a piece of ourselves." Nancy was surprised by the woman's perception. During all those years, few people had really understood the nature of the bond she had developed with Thomas. Mrs. Stella, with her life experience and natural sensitivity, had captured in a few days something that Michael had failed to see in decades. "I cared for a gentleman for 20 years, Nancy confessed, feeling an unexpected relief in talking about Thomas with someone who seemed genuinely interested. "He passed away last week, and now I don't know who I am without him." The two women talked for hours that afternoon. Mrs. Stella told about the challenges of reinventing life after losing her husband, about how she had discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed. Nancy, in turn, related for the first time to someone the details of her life with Thomas, the small rituals that had given meaning to her days, the way she had become invisible to the rest of the world. While Nancy tried to rebuild her life, at the boarding house, Michael continued his routine in Chicago, apparently unchanged by his father's passing. He had returned to work on the Monday following the burial, immersing himself in the negotiations and reports that had always been his priority. The sale of the mansion was being handled by a real estate agency, and he had instructed that all furniture be donated to a charity. During the first weeks, Michael managed to keep his focus on work and avoid thoughts about his father. He had built a successful life based on the ability to compartmentalize emotions and focus on practical goals. Thomas's passing was just another event that needed to be processed and filed away so that life could continue normally. But the nights began to become problematic. Michael, who had always fallen asleep easily after intense days of work, began to have difficulty falling asleep. When he finally managed, his dreams were disturbed by images of the mansion, of his father sitting in the living room armchair, of Nancy preparing the evening tea. They were fragmented memories that emerged without warning, bringing with them a sense of discomfort that he couldn't explain. On a particularly difficult night, Michael decided to have a few drinks at a bar near his apartment. It was an establishment, frequented by executives like him, a place where he could blend in with people who shared his lifestyle and professional concerns. But not even alcohol could erase the images that haunted him. It was on one of these nights that Michael met Charles, a college classmate he hadn't seen in years. Charles was at a corner table, also drinking alone, and the two ended up joining to reminisce about the old days. The conversation flowed naturally. But when Charles asked about family, Michael felt compelled to mention his father's recent passing. "I'm sorry, man," Charles said sincerely. "I know how hard it is to lose your father. Mine passed 3 years ago, and I still miss our conversations, the advice he gave. How was your relationship in the last few years?" The question caught Michael off guard. He realized with growing discomfort that he couldn't answer satisfactorily. His visits to his father had been sporadic and perfunctory, motivated more by obligation than genuine interest. He didn't know what Thomas's thoughts were in recent years, what his fears were, his hopes, his memories. "Actually," Michael admitted after an awkward pause, "we weren't very close. He had a caretaker who took care of everything." Charles looked at him with a strange expression. "A caretaker? And did you visit regularly?" "Not as much as I should have," Michael confessed, feeling for the first time a strange weight in his chest. "I had a lot of work, many commitments. I knew he was well cared for." "I understand," said Charles, but his tone had changed. "My father also had a caretaker in the last few months. Amazing woman, dedicated like few others. But I made a point of being present, you know. Those were the last moments we had together." That night, Michael returned home with a new and unpleasant sensation. Charles's words echoed in his mind, making him question choices he had considered obvious and justified. For the first time, he wondered if he had missed something important by completely delegating his father's care to Nancy. In the following days, Michael began to have unexpected flashbacks of moments with his father. He remembered Thomas trying to talk to him during his rare visits, the old man's eyes that seemed to seek connection, the frustrated attempts to establish dialogues that Michael always cut short with excuses about urgent professional commitments. It was during a particularly stressful meeting at work that Michael had a disturbing revelation. His boss was criticizing an employee who had neglected an important client, and the words echoed strangely in his mind. "You can't simply ignore the people who depend on you and expect everything to continue functioning perfectly." At that moment, Michael understood that he had done exactly that with his father. He had ignored Thomas, had delegated all care to Nancy, and had assumed that would be enough. He had never considered that his father might need more than physical care, that he might be yearning for emotional connection, for conversations, for signs that he was still important to his son. Guilt began to grow inside Michael like a dark seed. He tried to focus on work, but the meetings seemed empty. The reports lost importance, and he found himself obsessively thinking about what he had lost. It wasn't just the final years of his father's life, but decades of relationship that he had neglected in favor of a career that now seemed much less significant. It was then that Michael began to think of Nancy differently. During all those years, he had seen her as an employee, someone who provided a service for payment. But now, confronted with his own absence, he began to understand that Nancy had been much more than that. She had been the company he hadn't offered, the care he hadn't shown, the constant presence his father had needed, and that he had been unable to provide. Nancy had spent 20 years beside Thomas, had known his quirks, his fears, his joys. She had been the guardian of his memories, the witness to his final years, the person who had offered him the dignity and affection that Michael had neglected. And he had dismissed her as if she were disposable, without recognizing the magnitude of what she had represented in his father's life. The realization hit like a punch to the stomach. Nancy hadn't been just an employee. She had been the daughter that Michael hadn't managed to be, the company that Thomas had sought in him and hadn't found. And now she was alone in the world, dismissed without ceremony by a man who had failed to value either his father or the person who had dedicated her entire life to caring for him. 3 months had passed since Thomas's departure, and Nancy had established a simple routine at St. Joseph's boarding house. She had secured a part-time job at a nearby flower shop, helping with arrangements and taking care of the plants. It was humble work, but it gave her a sense of purpose and kept her financially stable. Contact with the flowers awakened memories of the mansion's garden, bringing a mixture of nostalgia and peace. During her free afternoons, Nancy had begun visiting a municipal nursing home where she offered companionship to the elderly who didn't receive family visits. Mrs. Stella had suggested the activity, intuiting that Nancy needed to channel her natural instinct to care for others. At the nursing home, she found dozens of people like Thomas, lonely elderly who longed for conversations, for a little attention, for someone who genuinely cared about their stories. It was on one of these afternoons at the nursing home that Nancy met Mr. Anthony, a 78-year-old man who had been abandoned by his family 2 years ago. He was intelligent and good-humored, but carried in his eyes the same sadness she had seen in Thomas in recent times. Nancy began to dedicate more time to him, listening to his stories about his youth in the countryside, about the children who no longer visited him, about the dreams he had left behind. "You have a special gift," said Mr. Anthony one afternoon, as Nancy helped him write a letter to a distant brother. "You truly see people, not just look at them. It's rare to find someone like that these days." Mr. Anthony's words touched Nancy deeply. During all those years caring for Thomas, she had questioned if her work had real value, if she was seen and recognized. At the nursing home, surrounded by people who genuinely appreciated her presence, she began to understand that she had developed a rare talent, the ability to see dignity and value in people the world had forgotten. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Michael was facing a personal crisis that was affecting all aspects of his life. Work, which had always been his refuge and source of identity, lost its meaning. He found himself looking out the office window during important meetings, thinking about his father, about Nancy, about lost opportunities for connection and love. The situation reached its limit on a Tuesday morning when Michael was reviewing an important contract and came across a clause about elderly care in an insurance policy. Suddenly, he was invaded by a vivid memory. Nancy helping Thomas get up from his chair, the care with which she held the old man's fragile arm, the infinite patience with which she repeated the same explanation about the medicines he always forgot. At that moment, Michael understood that he needed to find Nancy. Not to apologize, as he knew his words would be insufficient, but to try to correct, even if partially, the injustice he had committed. He cancelled all his appointments for the day and took the first flight to his hometown. The search for Nancy wasn't easy. Michael didn't know where she was living, didn't have her phone number, hadn't maintained any contact with her since the day of the burial. He began by asking in the neighborhood of the old mansion, which had already been sold and was being renovated by the new owners. An elderly neighbor remembered Nancy and mentioned having seen a woman who looked like her working at a flower shop downtown. That's how, on a Thursday afternoon, Michael found Nancy taking care of an arrangement of white roses at Springtime Flowers. She was concentrated on her work, with the same attention to detail that he remembered seeing her dedicate to everything in the mansion. For a moment, Michael stood at the door, observing her work, trying to find the courage to approach. When Nancy saw him, her first reaction was surprise, followed by an expression of caution. She didn't show anger or resentment, but there was in her eyes a distance that didn't exist before, a protection she had developed after months of emotional reconstruction. "Michael," she said simply, continuing to arrange the flowers. "What brings you here?" Michael had rehearsed a speech during the entire flight, but facing Nancy, all the prepared words seemed inadequate. He looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time in 20 years. He saw the grayer hair, the wrinkles he hadn't noticed before, the hands calloused by work, but also a new serenity that she didn't possess at the mansion. "Nancy, I need to talk to you. Can I take you for coffee?" Nancy hesitated, but something in Michael's voice, a vulnerability she had never heard before, made her accept. They went to a small bakery nearby where they sat at a corner table, away from the other customers. "Nancy," Michael began, the words coming out with difficulty, "I made a terrible mistake. Actually, I made many mistakes over many years. I didn't know how to value what you did for my father, didn't know how to recognize the extraordinary person you are." Nancy listened to him in silence, without interrupting, but also without showing if his words were having any impact. "During these months, I've thought a lot about my father, about the last years of his life, about how I was an absent and selfish son. And I understood that you were much more than a caretaker. You were the family he needed, and that I didn't know how to be." Tears began to roll down Michael's face, surprising both him and Nancy. "You dedicated 20 years of your life to caring for him with a love that I wasn't capable of giving, and when he passed away, I treated you as if you were disposable, as if all those years meant nothing." Nancy felt her own eyes filling with tears, not for Michael's words, but for the memories of Thomas they brought back. "Your father was a good man, Michael. He suffered from your absence, but never spoke ill of you. He always said you were a busy man, that you had your own life to take care of." "But that doesn't justify my absence," Michael insisted. "And much less does it justify the way I treated you. Nancy, I would like to do something to try to compensate, even if it's impossible to completely repair what I did." Nancy looked at him with curiosity, but also with a certain distrust. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to create an institute in memory of my father, focused on caring for elderly people in vulnerable situations, and I want you to be the director, to use all your experience and sensitivity to help other people like my father." Proposal caught Nancy completely off guard. "Michael, I don't have academic training for this. I'm just a simple woman who learned to care for people." "Exactly," Michael responded with conviction. "You have something that isn't learned in universities, the ability to see dignity in people, to care with genuine love, to be present when someone needs it. That's what makes the difference in the lives of the elderly." In the months that followed, Nancy found herself involved in the most challenging project of her life. Michael had allocated a significant part of his inheritance to create the Thomas Wilson Institute, an organization that would offer free home care for needy elderly, as well as train caregivers with the same spirit of dedication that Nancy had always demonstrated. The institute was installed in a spacious, cozy house in the same neighborhood where the old mansion was located. Nancy worked side by side with social workers, nurses, and psychologists to develop a program that focused not only on physical care, but also on the emotional well-being of the elderly served. During the development of the project, Michael and Nancy met regularly to discuss implementation details. These meetings became moments of healing for both. Michael listened to the stories Nancy told about Thomas, learning aspects of his father that he had missed due to his own absence. Nancy, in turn, helped Michael understand that there was still time to honor his father's memory through concrete actions. 6 months after the first meeting at the flower shop, the Thomas Wilson Institute was officially inaugurated. The ceremony took place on a sunny afternoon with the presence of local authorities, health professionals, and dozens of elderly people who would be served by the program. Michael gave an emotional speech about his father and about the invisible people of society, those who dedicate their lives to caring for others without seeking recognition. He spoke about Nancy, about the lesson of unconditional love she had taught through her example, about the importance of valuing those who are by our side before it's too late. Nancy, invited to speak after Michael, climbed to the small stage nervously. She had never spoken in public, had never been the center of attention, but when she looked at the audience and saw the faces of the elderly who would be served by the Institute, she found the right words. "For 20 years I had the privilege of caring for Mr. Thomas," she began with an emotional voice. "He taught me that love doesn't need words, that it expresses itself through small daily gestures, through being present, through caring with dedication. Today we have the opportunity to bring that same care to other people who need it. This institute is not just a social project, it's a declaration that every human being deserves dignity, affection, and respect, especially in their most fragile moments." The audience gave a standing ovation, and Nancy saw tears in the eyes of many people. At that moment, she understood that her life had found a new purpose, broader and more meaningful than she had ever imagined. In the following months, the Thomas Wilson Institute became a reference in the city. Nancy hired and trained a team of caregivers, always emphasizing that the work went far beyond technical tasks. She taught about the importance of listening, of talking, of treating each elderly person as a unique individual with their own history and dignity. 1 year after the inauguration, Nancy was in her office at the Institute when she received an unexpected call. It was Mr. Anthony, the elderly man she had met at the municipal nursing home. He had been transferred to the Institute's program and wanted to personally thank her for the change in his quality of life. "Nancy," he said with a choked voice, "you gave me back the will to live. It's not just the care I receive. It's knowing that someone cares about me, that my life still has value." That afternoon, while preparing her 5 o'clock tea, now in a porcelain cup that Michael had insisted on giving as a gift, Nancy reflected on the extraordinary journey her life had taken. She had lost Thomas, had faced abandonment and loneliness, but had found an even greater purpose, caring not just for one person, but for dozens of them, and training others to do the same. Michael had also transformed his life. He had drastically reduced his workload in Chicago, moving back to his hometown to closely follow the development of the Institute. He had discovered that his true vocation wasn't in business, but in using his resources and skills for causes that really mattered. On a special afternoon, 2 years after the Institute's inauguration, Nancy received an honor from the City Hall for the social work developed. During the ceremony, she looked at the audience and saw Michael in the first row, applauding with genuine pride. Beside him was Mrs. Stella, who had become one of the Institute's most dedicated volunteers. At the end of the ceremony, Michael approached Nancy. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for having cared for my father with so much love. Thank you for having forgiven me. And thank you for having taught me the true meaning of dedication." Nancy smiled, holding Michael's hands with the same gentleness with which she had held Thomas's hands for so many years. "Your father would be proud to see the man you've become, Michael, and he would be even prouder to know that his legacy is helping so many people." That night, Nancy returned to her apartment, now a comfortable space she had managed to rent with the Institute's salary. She prepared her evening tea and sat on the small balcony, observing the movement of the city. At 58, she had discovered that life still held extraordinary surprises for those who knew how to love without expecting anything in return. Thomas remained present in her memory, no longer as a pain or longing, but as a constant inspiration. Each elderly person she helped at the Institute carried a little of his essence. Each gesture of care was a tribute to the 20 years they had shared in loving silence. The Thomas Wilson Institute had become more than a social project. It was proof that true love is never lost. It only transforms and multiplies, touching lives in ways we cannot always predict or understand. The end. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Nancy and Thomas has touched your hearts in the same way it touched ours. This narrative reminds us that true heroes are often invisible, dedicating their lives to caring for others without seeking recognition. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving stories about love, dedication, and redemption. You can find it by clicking here. If this story awakened something special in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day, we bring unique narratives that explore the complexity of human life and the beauty of the deepest feelings. Tell us in the comments, do you know someone like Nancy who dedicates their life to caring for others? Your story